This view over Soho, done before the Twin Towers were destroyed, was actually done the winter before the trip to Egypt, and was done from the apartment window of friends of mine who had this view. And later they did see the towers fall. But the painting, I decided to do a print from the painting afterwards. But the Twin Towers are there and the Statue of Liberty is in the background. We decided to make the trip to Egypt after I completed this watercolor, which took several weeks, working every Sunday afternoon for about a 2-month period. I'm afraid it was a great inconvenience to my friends. I was invited to go out west to do paintings for the bicentennial celebration. The artists could go wherever they chose to go. The government set up a number of new realist painters. There were about 50 of us, and we could go wherever we wanted to in the United States. I chose to go to the Canyon de Chelly simply because it has the longest history of human habitation of any spot on our continent. And the painting is 4 by 4 feet, 4 feet square. I went there and I spent 2 weeks working on this painting in the morning and a second painting in the afternoon. This is the morning painting. It's of ancient ruins under this huge cliff. I returned a couple of years and made these drawings and watercolors and lithographs. Oh, this is a lithograph I drew on a lithographic plate at the other end of the Canyon de Chelly. And this is a watercolor that I made of the same spot, focusing on the dwellings in the caves. I fell in love with this huge cave, a recess in the cliff wall, because it looked like a gigantic face, maybe Boris Karloff in one of his roles. And the ruins in the far depths of the cave looked like his eyes, and his nose is made up of the dwellings outside. Then, somewhat later, my wife and I went to Egypt on our own, and I decided to do 3 paintings on our trip. We were with a group from the University of Chicago, led by 2 Egyptologists. This is my portrait of the Sphinx, done on site. One of the 3 paintings I did directly from life, I did it as a portrait of the Sphinx. Later, about 20 years later, I went to Egypt again and did this painting, a watercolor painting, on the spot at another temple. The line drawing, the work on paper, further developing it. While tourists looked on, I became a photo op. And this is the final watercolor painting. The color is different in the studio photograph than at the actual painting. This is from the earlier trip to Egypt that we took. I went very early in the morning to 3 sites. This is Abu Simbel, and this is the finished painting, the second day of work. This is the final painting on the watercolor. And this is a print that I did from the watercolor back in New York. Another site I worked at was the Temple of Hatshepsut, which is in the Valley of the Queens. And this is my view. I crept to the very top of that cliff and looked straight down, giving everybody else on the trip a heart attack. Or they didn't actually have a heart attack. This is walking down the other side of the cliff, and this is the view. I was up there, all the way at the very peak. This is from a later trip, about 20 years later. And the restoration work had been completed. But this is a mingling of shots I took of the interior on the first trip and with a few from the second trip. This is Hatshepsut shown pregnant, one of the few such representations in Egyptian art. And for her, the cow was sacred. And here she is as a child nursing from a cow. This is the top where I took the photograph, looking straight down. And those rocks have a surprising sculptural form to them. With the calf. This was taken on the later trip.
The other mortuary temple.
This is the view of the path that you walk down from the top of the cliff. The Valley of the Queens, where this is on the opposite side of the Valley of the Kings, where all the pharaohs were buried. Over Singapore on our way to Cambodia. This was in 1997.
Eight and done single, you're done single. You see by the leg, and you see the port or the skirt.
This is the temple site, which also has the palace of the king. It was called Siam, and the film Anna and the King of Siam was filmed here. I did not do watercolor. It simply wasn't time, and there was too much to see. Then we flew to Myanmar. And this was in the at a big temple in the big city at night. Then we flew from the big city to Pagán. And in Pagán is a medieval town in which all the wealthy people, apparently, I don't know where the wealth came from, but they each major family built its own temple. So now there's the field of temples, each one quite elaborate. And behind one of them I got assaulted by a group of people selling me fragments. I had no idea whether they were new casts of fragments or the original, so forth. This went on for quite a few minutes until our guide came along and chased them away.
What?
Yeah, that, yeah.
But it was exciting.
$10. Big one also. That, nice one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like this design.
Right.
$10.
What, yeah, the,
Yes, very good. Nothing.
Yeah. Only one. I have only one.
wait, I can't.
I did buy one Buddha head, which was painted a bright green, but it turned out to be stone and authentic from the 10th century.
I've got you and the painting.
And I picked the time to do a watercolor. I was only allowed the time when all the other tourists went to have lunch. But one woman also did watercolors, so she stayed with me. We climbed up, halfway up one temple to get a view, an overview, and we were allowed 1.5 hours, and then our bus would come back. The other woman decided to take this video of me instead of working on her own watercolor. Maybe she did a couple sketches.
Like anxiety because you have just a few more moments to paint.
But an hour and a half is not much time. This is the completed watercolor on site. And this is the original watercolor photographed in the studio. And this is a print I later made, another aquatint print. Then we went on to Angkor Wat. We went back to Cambodia. And visited Angkor Wat and ride through the jungles, see other temples which have been buried by the jungle. And I would love to go back, but I can't. However, we were limited to where we could walk. This was shortly after the fighting had ended, and the whole place was full of landmines, and a path had been cleared just around the temple itself, I guess for visitors. I would have loved to have done this view, which was at the back of the temple. But given the amount of time, the hour-and-a-half lunch period, I chose a view of the entrance. So this is the back side of the temple. It's a huge, huge construction, several city blocks long. And not easy for the older members of the tour group. There at the back there's this huge relief carving of the churning the butter of the Milky Way. All these people are helping. It's a marvelous carving, totally unknown in the art history I studied at NYU back in 1950-51. But it's really one of the great works I've seen in all my travels. It must be at least 50 or 70 feet long, pulling the huge tree trunk that did the churning. Now we're walking into the temple itself. We were confined to walking along this small area because of the landmines which had not been cleared from the whole premises.
Mountain itself. And now it is drinkable water, and the people come to drink it because it is holy water. Santa Claus used to baptize people with that.
I wasn't close to the guide, so I have no idea what we were looking at. I didn't bother reading labels, I just took photographs, the video. The temple dancers are shown everywhere. And on a dare, several of us did climb to the highest point. But I set up my easel in a spot that was easily accessible along a narrow pathway. And I chose this frontal view simply because it was the most most familiar of views, and people would know that it was Angkor Wat they were looking at. But we were only allowed 1.5 hours while everybody else had lunch. And the same woman took those photos of me working. Palmyra. This was another trip. The trip to Palmyra and Myanmar was in 1997.
Art Deco, great over the window. These must be ancient pillars.
They must be. Look at this building.
So this is the gate of the city of Palmyra. And the main street. There were two main streets, and they were lined with these colonnades. Apparently it was a very large commercial center. This building that we're visiting was demolished by ISIS when they took over, and they pulled the gate down as well. I decided to do a watercolor of this gate, which I did the next morning. Mr. George Yazbek and I got up about 5:30 in the morning. And that's when I took these photos. And then we're joined by the rest of the group as I finished my watercolor. Again, I was only allowed about an hour. Maybe an hour and a half. And then we were joined by the rest of the group. I got busy with my video camera. That's the back of the gate. And these are the colonnades along the main streets. There must have been bazaars lining the streets. There's a big crossroads marked by 4 of these colonnade units. This is the view I would have loved to have done a painting of, but there was no opportunity. And this is the theater that the colonnades lead to. And at this time, apparently, performances were done. And many tourists came. When I take these photos, I'm really looking for compositions. This was another good one. Those 4 groups of colonnades mark the crossroads. This would have made a nice watercolor too. As this would have. This is me now walking up. And there are the columns, groups of 4 each, that mark the crossroads. And on the distant hill, you see a fortress that apparently is of some later date. but we did go up to visit it. This is the view from the fortress. Each pockmark that you see in the desert has a ruin underneath it that has not yet been excavated at this time. There are many. The larger the pockmark is, the larger the ruin underneath it. There is no living city of Palmyra. Queen was Queen Zenobia, and it was contemporary with the height of the Roman Empire and along the Silk Road of trade. This is a watercolor that I did of the gate before we were joined very early in the morning. We started at about 5:30, and the rest of the company came along by 7. I later did a print of this as well. And that's the end.
You can ask for questions on your email.
The final shot should be put on of my email? Or is that, no, we don't want to do that.
No.
Okay.